Welcome to the Rotunda of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. We're covering the Constitutional Convention 1787 to 1789. And so what you're looking at here, some of you guys I'm sure have been to D.C. and you've been to the Rotunda, but what this room is this is the location where we house and sort of show the most important documents in the nation's history. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the U.S. Bill of Rights. And so this is an image that's obviously brightened up. If you've been to this room, it's very dark in there. And so it's brightened up so that we can really kind of see the room. But this room's dark because they're trying to preserve the documents and they don't want bright light fading the documents, which it will do. Additionally, it's also very cold because they're trying to prevent bacterial growth on the documents, which would decompose it were it to be growing on there. So at the top, what you'll see is the two Faulkner murals. Those were created in the 1930s. And so up here at the top, you have the Declaration of Independence. You have Thomas Jefferson right here, sort of showing off the document. And so over here on the right, you have the Constitution. You have George Washington at the center because he, of course, was the president of the Constitutional Convention. And then you have James Madison right here, 5'4", the father of the Constitution, as we call him. And so here he has kind of the document, and he and Washington are sort of exchanging this glance. Also, if you look back at the Declaration, you can find Abraham Lincoln in this. So, of course, though Abraham Lincoln was not present at the signing of the Declaration, Faulkner wanted to make sure that he was in this mural. See if you can find him. I'll give you a moment. Okay, that moment is up. If you have not found where Lincoln is in the mural, look at the clouds. All right, here is Lincoln. This is his nose, this is his mouth, and this is his chin, down to his neck. Again, chin, mouth, nose. And so that's the Faulkner mural inside the archives of the United States. And so here you are looking at a Google Earth image of Washington, D.C. And within the Constitution itself, which creates the entire city of Washington, D.C., you can see this language, Article 1, Section 8, which is page 2 if you ever look for it. And so in this, you see this language about Congress having exclusive legislative power over a district which will be not larger than 10 miles square that's going to be created. And so the District of Columbia is that district. That is what gets created, and it is 10 miles square. So this document itself, the Constitution, sets up this entire city. And so here is page 2 of the Constitution. My arrow covers it up a little bit, but here you can see the not exceeding 10 miles square. And so you can pull that up and look at some of the language. But again, there's the National Archives in the center. They intentionally put the National Archives with the Constitution centered between the branches of government and the buildings that were created as a result of the document. It's symbolic that they placed the National Archives exactly in the center between the White House, between the Congress and the Supreme Court. And so this is Pennsylvania Avenue that runs between the White House and Congress and the Supreme Court over here. But again, there are the three branches that the Constitution sets up. And for those of you who are curious again about a larger kind of look at D.C., you can see the memorials and you can see Union Station. And so the convention convenes at the Pennsylvania State House, otherwise known as Independence Hall, 1787. They think when they go in there that they're simply going to revise the articles. But after they look at it, they realize they're going to have to throw them completely out and start over. And so they plan to reconvene, and when they do, James Madison, is going to prepare by reading 100 plus books. Madison's taking his job very seriously. He wants to make sure that he sets up this government the right way. And so Madison's efforts as the main writer of the Constitution, didn't write it all, he's got help from other people, will get him the title Father of the Constitution. And in addition, Madison also takes the best notes by far, like during the convention in Philadelphia. And so as a result, we know what was going on in part thanks to Madison's notes. Jefferson and Adams, meanwhile, are away back serving as ambassadors in Europe. Jefferson to France and Adams to England. Washington serves as president of the convention. They have these major issues to address. How do we structure a government? How do we deal with representation on behalf of people? How do we deal with trade? The Articles did that terribly. You had states talking about going to war with one another during the Articles of Confederation. And also, how do we deal with this thorny, complicated issue of slavery? If they ban outright slavery, they just say it's gone, you're not going to get the southern states to agree to the Constitution. And so they have to kind of come to some compromise that's uncomfortable for us today. The first thing they do is the structure. As we know, the Articles had simply a legislative branch, in effect. And really now you're going to create an executive branch and a judicial branch in addition. The legislative makes the laws, the executive enforces them. The judicial branch then interprets those laws. And so the executive branch is going to be a big hang-up for a lot of people in determining whether they want to support this Constitution. They're afraid that they're going to recreate a king, that this new president idea will end up looking a lot like a king, like what they had in Europe. And so they don't want that. And people who are against this, many of them will be citing a powerful executive branch. But again, this separation of powers comes to us from the French philosopher Montesquieu, and then we have checks and balances, the idea that we can, through these checks and balances, make these branches equal and unable to gain too much power. The first plan for representation comes from Virginia. Virginia is the largest state, has the most population. It's the most important state. 7 of the first 10 presidents were from Virginia. And so Virginia has a nickname, Old Dominion. Old Dominion means the old power. And it all goes back to Virginia having the most power of the original states. Virginia wants a plan that benefits large states. Virginia thinks, hey, if we're a large state, we deserve representation that equals our population. And the small states, well, they should have very little representation because they don't have much population. Meanwhile, the small states don't like that idea. They want to be equal. And so they want a single house legislature, a unicameral legislature, which would have one vote per state, just like the Articles. And so the small states have their plan with New Jersey, the big states have their plan with Virginia, and they're deadlocked. And so finally what comes in is Connecticut comes up with what we call the Great Compromise. And so it breaks the deadlock over representation. The legislature would be bicameral, 2 House. The Senate would have 2 representatives per state. And that would be what the New Jersey plan wanted. The House of Representatives would be more what the Virginia plan wanted, or representations based on population. You will see in my classroom a Connecticut license plate, and it essentially says Constitution State on the license plate because Connecticut views themselves highly as being the ones who solved this big constitutional problem. Regulation of trade would also get solved with the Commerce Compromise. Basically, Congress could regulate trade. Additionally, they can tax imports. When you see they can tax imports, you should really be thinking tariffs there, which is now back in the news. And also, they want to touch slavery for at least 20 years until 1808. So they're going to leave that alone. Additionally, there is the awkward slavery population. How do we count slaves? The South wants slaves counted as population. The North wants them counted for taxation but not population. Ultimately, they come up with a 3/5 compromise. It's very awkward. Count every 5 slaves as 3 free persons for taxation and representation. Ultimately, the slaves aren't being represented. Uh, but in this scenario, of course, we look at this and we know that they're kind of being used. And so they're kind of in between what the South wants and what the North wants. It's a very awkward compromise. Ultimately, the signing occurs on September 17th, 1787. It's sent to the states for ratification, with 3/4 required for approval. So 3/4 with 13 states would mean 9 out of 13 would have to vote in favor. And so it takes a little while, but ultimately by 1789, okay, 9 out of 13 states have voted in favor, and it goes into full effect. So when you look at the document, kind of the largest signature up here is the president of the convention, George Washington himself. And so here you can see George Washington's signature up at the top. And then it goes state by state. You can see Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. There's James Madison. And you can kind of break these down a little bit and see the different representatives. Okay, and this is page 4 of the Constitution. So there's 4 different pages of it as they wrote it out. There's the famous painting of it. You've got Thomas Jefferson kind of almost whispering something in Franklin's ear. Franklin's got this kind of cheeky expression, looking dead set at the viewer. Over here you have James Madison. And so Washington, of course, stands up with his shoulders back, okay, looking powerful and as the convention president. And so what follows is, during this big debate of should we ratify or not, are the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison write basically with pseudonyms. They write anonymously. They write under the name Publius. And basically they write 85 essays that show up in the New York papers. Today we believe, in looking at researching the writing, that 51 of these were written by Hamilton. Madison, we believe, wrote 29, and John Jay wrote 5. These were an attempt to persuade people to ratify the Constitution, that this new Constitution would be good for them, and assure them that it would protect their rights. And so when we try to understand the Constitution, one of the things we do look at are these Federalist Papers. And so the Federalists are in favor. Federalists favor of the Constitution. Meanwhile, there are anti-Federalist papers. There are not as many. There was only 16 that were published. They were published under the names Cato and Brutus. And so these were attempts to persuade the public not to favor the Constitution. They were concerned about a central government that was too strong. And they were also concerned about a lack of Bill of Rights. And so you'll hear less about the Anti-Federalist Papers, but they're written as well, and they are under the pseudonyms Cato and Brutus. 2 of the famous Anti-Federalists that you need to know are Patrick Henry, and George Mason. Henry had famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And so he ultimately did not attend the convention. In hearing about it, he said, "I smell a rat" at Philadelphia. And so this is Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death." During the American Revolution, "I smelled a rat at Philadelphia" during the Constitutional Convention. George Mason, meanwhile, he writes Virginia's Bill of Rights, which comes out before the American version, and he refused to sign the Constitution on the basis that it didn't have one. And so it's through this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that ultimately there will be a Bill of Rights. They will attempt to satisfy the Anti-Federalists. And when they do, it helps in getting this process of the Constitution, of the Bill of Rights, ultimately created. Both sides, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, were necessary. Both made some good points. And so Thanks for listening. Make sure that you complete this and answer the questions.